Okay, let's dive into one of history's most persistent puzzles. The idea of a lost, advanced civilization vanished beneath the waves. It's a concept that immediately brings one name to mind: Atlantis.
Atlantis. And that name has just resonated through the ages, hasn't it? Igniting curiosity, fueling searches.
Inspiring countless stories. Exactly. Yeah. For this deep dive, we're going to unpack the legend of Atlantis using, well, a stack of sources: historical accounts, encyclopedic entries, philosophical texts, to really get to the core nuggets of knowledge.
And it's fascinating how much of our understanding, traces back to basically a single origin point. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE.
Right, but the story didn't just stay there, did it, in ancient philosophy?
Not at all.
It's exploded over centuries through interpretations, investigations, and, let's be honest, a whole lot of speculation. So our mission here is to help you navigate what the sources actually tell us, where the story began in ancient Greece, what Plato described.
How it's been interpreted over time, where people have actually looked for it.
And what modern scholars think today. We want to cut through some of the noise.
Yeah, and maybe get to the heart of why this story, a story from thousands of years ago, still captures our imagination so much.
Right.
What does it tell us about our fascination with lost worlds, myth, maybe even ourselves?
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. So, as you said, the foundation, the bedrock, really, is Plato. Yeah. His dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, are the only primary ancient sources we have for this story.
That's absolutely crucial to remember. And Plato doesn't claim he discovered Atlantis himself, right?
Yo!
He presents the story through the character Critias, who says he heard it from his grandfather.
Okay.
Who in turn heard it from the famous Athenian statesman Solon.
Solon, the lawgiver, from the 6th century BCE.
The very same. And the narrative, as Critias tells it, is that Solon learned it from an Egyptian priest in the city of Sais.
Right.
And this priest apparently pointed to ancient records suggesting this civilization existed 9,000 years before Solon's visit.
9,000 years.
Which puts it way back, around 9600 BCE.
9,000 years before ancient Greece. That time frame alone is just...
Wow. So what did Plato, through Critias, actually describe this place as being like?
Well, it's quite a detailed picture he paints. The island, Atlantis, was supposedly located beyond the Pillars of Hercules.
Which we generally take to mean the Strait of Gibraltar today.
Mostly, yes. Though some sources we looked at note an interesting point, that in earlier times, before the 6th century BCE, the Pillars of Hercules might have actually referred to mountains much closer to home for the Greeks, perhaps in the Laconian Gulf within Greece itself.
Oh, interesting. So potentially out in the Atlantic, or maybe closer than we usually assume.
Exactly. It adds a layer of ambiguity right from the start. But according to the main description, Atlantis was enormous, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined.
Just think about that scale in the ancient world. Bigger than North Africa and modern Turkey put together. It's truly vast. And geographically, it wasn't just flat, it was diverse. Mountains in the north and along the coast, a huge oblong plain in the south, thousands of stadia across.
Okay.
And a central island, which had its own mountain inland.
So a complex landscape.
Very. And the legend ties it directly to the divine. Poseidon, the sea god, supposedly protected it. He established his son, Atlas, as the first king. And that's where the name comes from, Atlas Atlantis, Atlantic Ocean.
Ah, makes sense, a divine lineage. And the society itself, what was it like?
Initially, it's painted as, virtuous and advanced culture. Plato's sources mentioned they had a constitution that perhaps suspiciously bore a remarkable resemblance to the ideal society Plato lays out in his own work, The Republic.
Well, that parallel, that immediately raises an eyebrow, doesn't it? An ideal society, just like Plato's own philosophical creation. But this virtue, it didn't last.
No, that's the tragedy of the story. As their power and wealth grew, their ethics declined. They became imperialistic. Their armies apparently conquered parts of Africa, as far as Egypt, and parts of Europe, reaching Tyrrhenia, that's Etruscan Italy.
Yeah.
And they subjected the peoples they conquered.
Right, the classic story of power corrupting. And this sounds like the kind of empire that would inevitably clash with a rising power like, say, Athens.
Precisely. And that's the climax of the historical part of the tale. A conflict erupts. An Athenian-led alliance initially pushes back the Atlanteans. But then that alliance falters. And Athens is said to have stood alone, ultimately defeating the massive Atlantean Empire and liberating the lands it had occupied.
Wow. Athens single-handedly defeating this colossal, divinely descended empire. Quite the heroic tale for an Athenian audience.
Very much so. And then comes the legendary catastrophe.
The big one.
Yes. According to the account, following this defeat and presumably because of their moral decay, divine punishment struck. The island was hit by violent earthquakes and floods and sank beneath the sea in a single terrible day and night. Gone. Leaving behind only an impassable mud shoal.
Just vanished. A truly dramatic sudden end. Which brings us, I think, to the central debate you find woven through all the sources. Was Plato actually presenting this as history? Or was there a deeper purpose? An allegory?
This is maybe the most critical question, isn't it? What was Plato really trying to tell us? And the sources we consulted, particularly scholarly analyses, lean heavily towards the idea that Plato used Atlantis as an allegory.
A teaching story.
Exactly. It could be a way to illustrate his philosophical concepts from the Republic, by contrasting the virtuous early Atlantis with its later corrupt imperial form.
Using Atlantis as a kind of cautionary tale. Makes sense.
It could also serve as a warning specifically against imperialism or the dangers of excessive naval power. These were themes highly relevant to Athens at the time, especially after things like the disastrous invasion of Sicily in 413 BCE, which our sources mention as a potential real-world parallel Plato might have had in mind.
They also point to the destruction of the city Helic, right? By earthquake and tsunami.
Yes, in 373 BCE, not long before Plato wrote. A real-world catastrophe that could easily have inspired the description of Atlantis' end.
And Creus himself, the character telling the story in the dialogue, he explicitly links the Atlantis narrative to the ideal city Socrates describes in the Republic.
It does.
That connection feels very pointed. It strongly suggests a fictional comparative purpose rather than straight history.
It really does. While Plato frames it very cleverly as history passed down through generations, the scholarly consensus strongly points toward a philosophical or political intent behind it all. The story serves as a mirror, maybe, reflecting Athens' own potential virtues and vices.
So Plato writes this in the 4th century BCE. How was the story actually viewed back then in ancient times? Did everyone just accept it as fact?
Oh, definitely not. Even in antiquity, its historicity was up for debate. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, reportedly believed Plato invented the whole thing.
Really? His own student?
Yeah. He saw it as a device, a teaching tool for Plato's philosophical lessons. So right from the beginning, the idea of it being a philosophical construct was there.
Okay.
Though there were definitely others who seemed to take it more literally. Sources mention Crantor.
Plato's student, right.
That's the one. He might have viewed it as real history. There are even these ancient claims, though they're pretty heavily debated now, claims passed down by later writers like Proclus, suggesting Crantor actually saw pillars in Egypt with hieroglyphs that confirm the story.
Pillars in Egypt. Wow. But modern scholars doubt that part.
Yeah, largely dismissed today. But the fact that the debate was even happening shows the story had some traction as potentially historical, even back then.
Fascinating. Who else in antiquity engaged with it as if it might be real?
Well, sources mention geographers like Strabo and Posidonius discussing it, and later on, you see Christian writers like Tertullian and Arnobius referencing it. Sometimes they treated it as historical fact, other times they used it to support their own theological arguments.
Right.
You even had Cosmas Indicopleistes using it, bizarrely, in an attempt to prove the world was flat.
Okay, that's creative. And what about that other earlier work called Atlantis by Hellanicus of Lesbos? Did Plato just borrow the story from him?
Good question. The sources are pretty clear on this. Hellanicus's work, which did come before Plato, wasn't about a lost island empire. It was most likely a genealogy, focusing on the mythological figure Atlas and his daughters, the Atlantids.
Got it. So different subject matter.
Exactly. Plato might have borrowed the name Atlantis or maybe some elements related to the Atlas myth, but the core narrative of the lost advanced civilization that fought Athens and sank, that seems unique to Plato's dialogues.
So the story kind of bubbles along through antiquity, debated but known, but then it seems to really flare up again much, much later. What caused this big revival in modern times?
Well, the age of exploration was a huge factor. Suddenly, Europeans are encountering these vast, previously unknown lands across the Atlantic, the Americas. And some people started to wonder, could these be Atlantis? Or connected to it somehow? It sparked a whole new wave of interest and speculation.
And the idea quickly found its way into literature, didn't it?
Absolutely. You get Francis Bacon's famous utopian novel, The New Atlantis, in 1627. It clearly depicts an advanced, hidden society inspired by Plato's idea.
And even earlier, Sir Thomas More's Utopia.
Right. More drew inspiration from both the Atlantis legend and the reports coming back from the newly discovered Americas. This idea of a distant, perhaps perfect or just different society was really potent.
But the person who really seemed to blast Atlantis back into the popular consciousness was Ignatius Donnelly.
Oh, definitely. His 1882 book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, was a massive bestseller, hugely influential. Donnelly basically took Plato's account as literal truth and ran with it. He hypothesized that Atlantis was a real highly advanced civilization.
The source of everything.
Pretty much. The origin point for most of the world's ancient cultures and civilizations.
Yeah.
He believed its influence spread globally through emigration before the big catastrophe.
That sounds like it laid the groundwork for a lot of later, more esoteric theories.
It absolutely did. Donnelly's ideas were picked up and elaborated on by movements like Theosophy. Figures like Madame Blavatsky incorporated Atlantis into their mystical systems, talking about lost spiritual knowledge, ancient masters, that sort of thing.
And then came Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. He really went all in on Atlantis.
Right. Cayce claimed he could access information about Atlantis through psychic readings, the Akashic records. He gave incredibly detailed descriptions, claimed many people living then were reincarnations of Atlanteans.
And made specific predictions, didn't he? Like it would rise again.
Yes, he predicted parts of Atlantis would rise near the Bahamas in the late 1960s. And he talked about a hidden hall of records near the Sphinx in Egypt, supposedly containing the true history of Atlantis.
It's just remarkable how one ancient story, possibly allegorical, can morph into these incredibly elaborate belief systems, blending bits of history, myth, and psychic claims. So given this whole long history of interpretation, speculation, esoteric beliefs, where do things stand today? What's the sort of scholarly consensus versus the popular belief?
Well, the overwhelming majority of present-day classicists, philologists, archaeologists, basically academic experts, view Atlantis as a fictional creation by Plato.
A philosophical allegory.
Yes, or at best, a myth heavily inspired by real events like Thera or Helic, but fundamentally constructed for a didactic purpose. They point to the literary structure of the dialogues, internal inconsistencies in the story, Plato's known habit of using myths to explain complex ideas.
Right.
As our sources really emphasize, for scholars, the value isn't in finding a literal sunken city. It's in understanding the lessons Plato embedded in the story about society, power, hubris, morality.
The message is the treasure, not the map.
Precisely put. However, in popular culture, the idea of a real physical lost continent or city, that persists strongly.
Oh, absolutely.
It's often fueled by, let's say, less critical interpretations, pseudoscience, romantic notions of lost golden ages, and just that enduring human fascination with mystery.
Even though science weighs against it.
Right. Especially since the 1960s, the geological understanding of plate tectonics and continental drift makes the idea of a large continent just sinking without a trace in the Atlantic, in the relatively recent geological past described by Plato's timeline, extremely improbable. Scientifically, it doesn't really hold water.
Okay. But despite that scientific and scholarly consensus, the search for a physical location has become a huge part of the Atlantis story itself. Our sources mention dozens, maybe hundreds, of proposed sites.
It's true. The name Atlantis has almost become generic, hasn't it? A label slapped onto almost any mysterious underwater ruin or lost place theory.
And often not even in the Atlantic Ocean, despite the name.
Exactly.
Let's maybe touch on some of the more prominent or plausible-sounding hypotheses that come up in the sources, starting maybe within the Mediterranean.
Okay. Probably the most popular candidate, and the one with some genuine archaeological connection, is the Greek island of Santorini. Ancient Thera.
Because of the volcano.
Precisely. The massive Bronze Age eruption there, around 1600 BCE, was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. It definitely caused catastrophic tsunamis that devastated the Minoan civilization on nearby Crete. So the theory goes, maybe this real catastrophe was the kernel of truth behind Plato's story. Perhaps the timeline got massively distorted over the millennia, or Plato misunderstood his sources.
It's a compelling parallel, you have to admit. A sophisticated island civilization wiped out by a natural disaster.
It is. But the sources also raise significant criticism.
Yes, such as?
Well, for one, ancient Greeks knew about volcanoes. If Thera was the basis, why didn't Plato just say a volcanic eruption destroyed it?
Yeah.
Why the earthquakes and floods narrative?
Good point.
Also, archaeology shows that while Minoan Crete was devastated, life did continue, especially in towns away from the direct tsunami impact. It wasn't the sudden, complete disappearance Plato describes for Atlantis.
Right. Not quite a perfect fit. What other Mediterranean possibilities get mentioned?
There's the submerged Spartel Island near the Strait of Gibraltar. It's a bank that would have been an island during the lower sea levels of the last ice age, closer to Plato's 9600 BCE time frame.
Okay.
But the sources note it really doesn't match Plato's detailed geographical description of Atlantis, the mountains, the plain, the city structure. It's just a submerged shoal.
And what about that idea you mentioned earlier about the Pillars of Hercules maybe being in the Laconian Gulf in Greece?
Yes, that interpretation tries to keep the story closer to home. If the pillars originally meant mountains in Greece, then the story could be linked more directly to events impacting the Greek mainland or Asian, like the Thera eruptions effects, or maybe the broader societal collapse around the late Bronze Age.
So Plato might have been drawing on half-remembered local catastrophes, perhaps conflating them, and setting his allegorical conflict near Athens.
It's a possibility. It suggests Plato might have been unaware that the term Pillars of Hercules had shifted its meaning to Gibraltar by his time.
Interesting. So those are some Mediterranean ideas, but the search definitely went further afield, right? Back out into the Atlantic.
Oh, yes. Donnelly, of course, put it squarely in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on his maps. More recently, you've had claims connecting Atlantis to marshlands in Andalusia in southern Spain, specifically the Doñana National Park area.
Right. I remember headlines about that a few years ago. Something about satellite images and tsunami evidence. Professor Freund.
That's the one, Richard Freund.
Yep.
He linked the area to a possible settlement destroyed by a tsunami, citing features visible in satellite imagery and some archaeological work.
But the sources we looked at seemed pretty critical of those specific Atlantis claims.
Very critical. They highlight that the Spanish scientists whose actual archaeological and geological work in Doñana was being referenced have largely dismissed Freund's Atlantis conclusions. They see it as a sensationalized interpretation, possibly confusing evidence related to the known ancient Tartessos culture in that region.
Ah, Tartessos, which itself has sometimes been speculatively linked to Atlantis, hasn't it?
Yes, the historian Adolf Schulten proposed that back in the 1920s. So the recent claims might be recycling older ideas or misinterpreting data related to Tartessos, according to the Spanish researchers.
So that specific discovery seems highly disputed by the experts actually working on the ground there.
That seems to be the case. And beyond Spain, the list of proposed locations mentioned in various sources is just wild. Antarctica, the Caribbean, Cuba, the Bahamas, Bimini Road, even places in the Pacific and Indian Oceans like Sundaland or the mythical Kumari Condom.
It really does seem like Atlantis has become this sort of free-floating signifier for any lost land or underwater mystery.
It really has. But just to reiterate the scholarly view and maybe the key takeaway here, none of these locations have been convincingly scientifically proven to be Plato's Atlantis. And the geological evidence, especially concerning continental drift, makes the core idea of a large continent sinking like that, particularly in the Atlantic, highly improbable in recent geological time.
Okay, so whether it was a real place, an allegory, or something in between, the impact of Atlantis on culture is just undeniable. It goes way beyond historical debates or geographical searches.
Absolutely. The very concept of a lost, advanced world has been incredibly fertile ground for artists, writers, thinkers for centuries. We already mentioned Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis and Thomas More's Utopia. They use this idea of a distant, perhaps superior society to explore political and social ideals.
And that theme, the utopian or sometimes dystopian society on a lost island, just kept going. Sources mention later works like Delaire Via Manley's The New Atlantis, which was actually a political satire.
Right. And David MacLean Perry's The Scarlet Empire, which was a socialist dystopia set in Atlantis. Even a Russian futurist poem, The Fall of Atlantis by Vladimir Khlebnikov.
So it could be adapted to critique contemporary society, explore different political systems.
Exactly. Or just retell the epic catastrophe. The stack mentions several epic poems from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that did just that, or imagined recovering lost Atlantean wisdom.
So it wasn't just prose, it inspired poetry across different genres too.
Yes, and the influence isn't limited to the written word. Sources also mention artistic representations, particularly in sculpture. Works like Einar Johnson's The King of Atlantis or Ivan Metrovich's sculpture titled Atlantis. They often use these powerful single figures to symbolize ideas associated with the myth, lost glory, suffering, forgotten power.
There's also a very modern sculpture mentioned, right? Look, Van Soom's The Man of Atlantis, the figure in the diving suit.
Yes, that's a striking one. The artist explicitly connects it to a very contemporary anxiety, global warming and rising sea levels.
How so?
The sculpture suggests that maybe humanity, facing environmental catastrophe, might have to adapt to an aquatic future, perhaps even evolving into fish-like creatures, as the artist put it. It draws this direct line from the ancient myth of a civilization lost to the sea to our modern fears about our own potential future caused by climate change.
Wow, that's a really powerful reinterpretation. Taking an ancient myth and making it speak directly to 21st century concerns.
It's a vivid example of how enduring these stories can be, how they can be constantly reread and reimagined to reflect the challenges and hopes of different eras.
It truly is. From a philosophical allegory in ancient Greece, possibly warning about Athenian hubris, to a symbol for climate change adaptation today. The journey of this story is just extraordinary. So, let's try to wrap this up. We've traced the Atlantis story from its clear origins in Plato's dialogues,
Followed its winding path through centuries of interpretation, belief, skepticism, searching.
and seen its undeniable pervasive presence in modern culture, from literature to art to New Age beliefs.
And hopefully you've seen how a single tale, whether Plato intended it as history or, more likely, allegory, can ignite such widespread belief, spark actual scientific investigations and sharp critiques, and inspire just countless creative works.
It really does make you circle back to that question. Why this particular story? Why does Atlantis hold such enduring appeal generation after generation? Is it just, the basic human fascination with lost worlds and unsolved mysteries?
Or maybe a deeper desire for some kind of forgotten knowledge, ancient wisdom, maybe a connection to a purer golden age.
Or does it tap into that fundamental longing for the idea of a perfect society, one that existed or could have existed but was tragically lost?
Could be all of those things, couldn't it? But if we go back to what seems likely to have been Plato's original intent, that warning against hubris, against imperial overreach, against the moral corruption that often comes with unchecked power, then maybe the most valuable deep dive into Atlantis isn't actually about locating ruins on the seabed.
It's about understanding the timeless lessons that Plato might have embedded within the myth itself.
A cautionary tale about the cyclical nature of civilizations, maybe.
Yeah.
About virtue and corruption, power and its consequences.
Exactly. Something for you, the listener, to ponder.